And so normally we have a little giveaway that we do. This time, it's t-shirt, it's bag, and it's also this cool monster book that I got to work on. I was a technical consultant helping them know the difference between mold and cast and silicone and latex and foam and all that fun stuff. If anyone knows what spaga means, put your hand up. All right, that was the first hand up. What do you got?
It's the sign on the outside of the cantina.
That's what it is. You won. Come on up. Awesome. And if you didn't win, we have them at booth 1031 at a show special price, $20. Really cool. Thank you. Booth 1031. He just really likes Halloween. 1031. See, that's there. Do we have slides yet? Not yet. It's tough to make your way through. The guy had to go a couple rooms over to get the slide. Want to do a question?
Well, we could talk about some quick genesis as to how some of the stuff came about. As Tom described, I mean, we're old school fans that connected online, and I think this not to make it too much of a history lesson, but we take it for granted as to how accessible film content is nowadays. When we were first poring over all the intricate details of the cantina, we had to be happy with VHS resolution, picture imagery, pausing it, and hopefully being able to glean anything out of 640 or less pixels out of that image.
Smeary, badly tracked.
And with each subsequent release, the DVD was a blessing, because now we got higher resolution, and we're able to freeze that, and then finally the Blu-ray came out. Again, one of the perks, and this isn't why I got the job, but it's a benefit that I do have the job of being at Lucasfilm, is having access to their photo archives as well as their physical drop archives. And a lot of the mysteries that had been raised by the cantina, mostly because it was a fairly poorly documented shoot. And so as a result, it raises a lot of questions as to what creatures were where, when were they shot, who performed what character, and what does that character actually look like. We were able to piece together a lot of those unanswered questions by actually having access to photos from Lucasfilm Archive.
And I think the other thing, any people who grew up in the 70s and 80s here? Okay, a few, I figured. I remember I would buy a magazine or a book if it had one picture I had never seen before from Star Wars, especially if it was behind the scenes photo. If it was shot from the film, whatever. All right, quiet round of applause. Yes?
Good news?
Yeah?
Good news.
All right.
Our hero. Now, and again, to put things into context, there was a book that came out in the 90s called the Star Wars Chronicles, which at the time I remember being about $200. And the idea of spending $200 on a book in the mid-90s was like, who does that? And now we have since published it. In fact, I've authored several books that cost north of that. But at the time, that was like the trove. Those were filled with imagery that we had never seen before.
Yeah.
And so, as a result, it's like geeking out over stuff like that is the way, Tom and I would connect. It's like
that and things like Life Debt, Schmeif Debt, which just let me know this was a guy that has my kind of humor.
Yeah, we'll get into that. So we'll give it a minute while we get all hooked up. And will you be able to pull audio from me?
Okay, yeah. If we could dim the house lights for folks too, that'd be fantastic. So, we're going to start this Cantina panel in an unusual place in an unusual time. That time is 1985. If anyone knows where this is going, I'm gonna, that's more likely. Okay, so, let's start in 1985. This was only recently discovered. There was a music video in 1985 using cutting-edge technology called cross dissolves that looped people together as they sang the same song. And just give me a gasp or an ooh or an ah or cheer when you see a familiar face here. So, in the middle of, what is it, Godly and Cream? Why is this? There we go. We have a brief appearance by Ted Burnett, who is also known as everybody's favorite mug in the cantina, the cantina bar. There we go. All right, having minor. All right. Will do. So, these are shots that Pablo found in Lucasfilm.
That's right. So one of the great troves that I found were the headshots of the various human characters. And these were performers that were sourced from the ugly casting agency. And that may sound mean, but that is the name of the casting agency. They specialize in people who are not known for their good looks. They're specialized in unusual appearances, not your basically cookie cutter leading man or leading lady.
I believe Ted Burnett qualifies.
Yes.
I love the suit though. Also, this was the image on the right is something you turned up.
That's right. So among some of the things that we found, John Molo costume sketches. The late great John Molo was the costume designer on Star Wars. And we saw something that was supposed to distinguish the bartender from everyone else, which was this necklace.
Which is labeled Rusty Necklace
Yeah.
in the little hand
It
sketch.
should have been the character's name.
That's right.
The bartender should have been named Rusty Necklace.
Or at least a drink. Oh my gosh.
The Rusty
They
Necklace.
need to have a Rusty Necklace
Go to
drink
a
at
bar,
like the cantina.
order the Rusty Necklace, and let me know what they give you.
Yeah. Now here's the real neat thing. There is a note on the bottom right, and that is the orchestra for the cantina. So when they shot in the U.S., in the U.K., where they shot most of the wide shots and all the principal photography, the bartender was there, and they list that as having an orchestra. It never did ultimately, but the bartender's number, if he's number 3, is listed as in the orchestra. So I'm just picturing Ted Burnett like in the front crooning, or something.
And a jug.
Yeah. So here's another one of those headshots. Does anybody know who this fella is? There you go. You'll be dead. So there's his ugly agency card. So a lot of these, we actually got in touch with the folks. The agency is still around, and they had catalogs from back in the day, and that's where some of these images, like the ones on the right, came from. That was his catalog page. And the little inset they were talking about measurements, that's from Stuart Freeborn's notes. Stuart Freeborn was the late great makeup artist on Star Wars, and that's Charlie Parker, not the jazz musician, making up Dr. Evazan.
Alfie recently passed away, so I'm glad we're able to celebrate and discover these things because a lot of this information is otherwise undocumented as far as who played these characters.
This came right out of your old website. The fact that these 3 fellas from Jabba's scene that was excised from the movie are actually in the bar, hanging out in the back. And you've got Tommy Weldon there playing the fellow with the goggles. You've got the pointy hat guy, which just goes to show we don't know who that pointy hat guy is. We don't know the actor. Yeah. And there's reasonable shots of his face. And we don't know who played Walrus Man yet. That kills me.
Still a mystery.
People keep suggesting very tall folks, but if you look, he's actually shorter than Dr. Evazan. But the pointy hat guy stole his gun, so I guess because that scene's after, so maybe he scooped it up on the floor because he was in the cantina. I'm just suggesting, if somebody who's in the story group wants ideas. Here's one of your favorites.
Yes, Ron Tarr. And what I love about Ron Tarr is his name sounds like what he looks like. I am Ron Tarr. He's a big, burly gentleman, and he is in the background of Cantina, but he is most famously visible in another bar from a Lucasfilm production. He is Lug in the tavern scene from Willow, which is celebrating its 30th anniversary this year, by the way. So Ron Tarr plays Lug, not a woman, that guy from Willow, and he's in the Cantina as well.
And there he is, Big Ron Tarr, his name. He was a Corellian pirate He got general makeup, that was the GMU down there. And there's the guy behind the jug who's still hiding from us behind jugs.
That's right.
And it kills us.
This is our white whale. This is our,
Right.
you know, Tom and I obsess about every little new information that comes out of the cantina because maybe we hope someday it will solve who is the guy behind the jar there.
Anybody know who this one is?
The one with the...
Yes,
Good.
the one with is the correct answer. Yes, the trombonist. He's a trombonist. Yeah, no, he's in the orchestra. So yes,
He's
this
the
is
smoker.
the smoker. There we go. He's also stolen a blaster from earlier in the movie. One of the dead rebels. He scooped it up and put that on his hip. And he's wearing a makeup that was done by Nick Maley, who's still around. Has a great little place in St. Martin that's called That Yoda Guy's Place. And he worked with Stewart on Yoda. He helped on the Cantina, and this was one of his first film scene makeups. And, like, what a way to start.
So Roy State is the actor's name, and the expanded universe, when they took this guy's name, or this guy's look, for the Tales from Mos Eisley Cantina anthology, gave him this incredibly elaborate and gothic story about him being a 1,000-year-old vampire that would suck the luck out of your being. But you look at him, he's a pretty goofy-looking guy. And that is the result of the author of that short story, just being very creative and following flights of fancy and seeing where the story took her. But in this case, the thought behind the character is that he's a bureaucrat. That outfit is the sort of tattling bureaucrat outfit. And the only notation that we have among this character and some other human-like characters is that they're mutants. So, is he a 1,000-year-old vampire? Maybe. Is he a bureaucrat who's a mutant that likes to tell people he's a 1,000-year-old vampire?
Maybe more likely. Does he just like soup? If anybody knows the story, this is right? So the funny thing is that in this, so this is not a behind-the-scenes photo. This is a still from the movie, and this killed me when I figured this out 38 years after watching this movie obsessively. The other guy is not the only smoker in the cantina. This guy actually, had the temerity to not even put a cigarette out when they called action. And it's this fellow who looks like the type of fellow who would have that sort of temerity. So yes,
We have to be careful because if that word of that gets out, Star Wars automatically gets a PG-13 rating.
oh goodness. Don't tell
So
anyone.
nobody tell
Yeah,
anyone.
okay, this is our secret. We also, behind George Stock, a little further down, and by the way, George also plays one of the
Generals, yeah.
general dignitaries, whatever. And his jacket makes an appearance in the alleyways of Mos Eisley. This fella here is Isaac Graham. We found him in another movie where he's a tailor. You don't see the person he's tailoring, but it looks like he's working on a lamp. This is one of those ones. This is the sort of research that's done on this. People scouring other movies where someone's rumored to be in it to find a picture of the guy to match him up to someone that we have a shot of in Star Wars. And Pablo turned up this, which is clearly that guy.
From the ugly catalog.
Right, but
Seems like an okay looking
seems
guy.
like an okay looking guy.
I don't know why.
But it didn't have a name. We didn't know who he was, and then it was I have a nose thing. I'm what we call a nasal American, and I don't like smushed noses. And he was a boxer, by the way. That's how that happened, and that's how he ended up in the Italy
It's
agency.
a turnbuckle tester.
George the Animal Steel guy. So here's Stewart's notes in the middle, saying he was going to get a nose cast and possibly twisted lips for this fella. And a nose cast means he was taking a mold of his nose so that he could make an appliance, which was helpful in us figuring out who this fella might be. I've got Robert Davies, what did it say here? Yeah, short red hair and funny eyes. I'd say that qualifies. And there's another shot taken by the on-set photography, and behind him, or rather the casting photography, and behind Obi-Wan there, you do get a good look at this fella, and he does have a little nose appliance on. So we were able to find him in a movie playing a Nazi. I don't even remember the name of the movie now. This is one of those ones I never thought we were going to figure this out. In the black and white cut of this movie, you can see a guy that's standing behind a table Luke crashes into. Doesn't even make it in the final cut, but Colin Skeeping, who is a stunt performer, is still around and was able to confirm for us that that he was there because it was a stunt and they didn't want somebody else to get hurt. Colin Skeeping also famously
He's in Top Secret.
He is in Top Secret. He plays Souffle. Now there's another Cantina person. We don't have a page on him, I think, in this panel, but he is also in Top Secret, and you've just like made this connection
Right, just
last
yesterday,
night.
I texted Tom a photo of the scene from Top Secret. If any of you follow me on Twitter, first of all, apologies. And second, if you're wondering why I posted a picture of Top Secret, that's because the little German is also the little person that's at the bar, the little human, which in production name is called Flash Gordon Midget, which isn't a great name. His in-universe name is Riker Roger, but it's played by Marcus Powell, and he's not only, he's in the Cantina, and he's the little German in Top Secret.
That's two Top Secret people in it. This was another one. It's almost like the guy behind the jug, you know, and so we were calling him Eyebrows for years because that was the most prominent feature, and then Leah Manning actually found him in an old episode of Doctor Who, off on the back, and it was Bob Watson, and so what ends up happening a lot of times, that's a great shirt, sir. It's a shag art Cantina
Yes.
thing, love it. What happens a lot is we'll find someone in another production, and then we'll go through that production's list and match it with some behind-the-scenes list that we have, call sheets or Stuart Freeborn's notes. And Bob Watson was a name that we had on there for years, but never knew what he looked like. And then there we go, we found him in Doctor Who. And they're not all ugly. So here's Mandy Morton, who played a local girl. She wears a similar outfit to Kustar.
Yeah, Cammy. Yeah, so there were a handful of local girls, both in the Cantina and in the streets of Mos Eisley outside of the Cantina.
And Molo did a lot of that, where he would take the bureaucrats, they wear these, the local girls wear these, the farmers wear these, and it was a way to keep costs down by not having to repattern everything over and over again. Also wearing a similar outfit is Jenna Cresswell, who plays Jenny.
Jenny, yeah, this is probably the most famous or infamous local girl, depending from your angle and your fanship for Han Solo. Unseen in the finished film, but is seen in a rough cut and has since been released in various formats, including a DVD-ROM back in the day and a Blu-ray cutscene, is a rough cut version of the Cantina where you see that Han was actually making out with one of the local girls before he sits down with Obi-Wan and Luke to hammer out a deal. So he just basically tells her to,
Yeah, it's like,
"Go on,
sweetheart." Yeah, he sends her away.
And sure enough, when he leaves the Cantina after blasting Greedo, she's there. You'd have to turn up your contrast on your TV to see this, because this isn't the final cut. And she goes walking towards him as if, "Aren't you even going to say goodbye to me after?"
And he leaves, and she just turns around all sad and walks away. It's just, and you thought him shooting first was heartless. And Pam Rose. Pam is, she's very active on Facebook now, and she's an absolute sweetheart. That's her today on the right with her life cast that Stuart Freeborn took when they were making her Head Up Lions. And she was an amateur photographer, and she took this one photograph of her in the makeup chair just after getting her head put on.
I'd like to say that's the first Star Wars selfie ever taken.
I think, yeah. And the pictures here are actually Stuart Freeborn's hand-drawn sketches for ideas of what they could do with the character Weird Girl. And these are the types of names you had back then.
And if you see the reference photography of Weird Girl, she's in front of Millennium Falcon, and that's because the Millennium Falcon set, the Docking Bay 94 set, was right next door to the Cantina set, which is why certain characters were easy to transport from one area to the other. For reference photography or for actual footage, as we saw from the deleted Jabba the Hutt scene that had a bunch of Cantina extras in it.
And one of the things Pam said, so a lot of the aliens didn't get close up behind the scenes, reference shots like that, continuity shots. And Pam said it's because they shot them at lunch. And most of the people would rather eat lunch. So that's what would happen. What was neat, she also used to knit on set, and she was thrilled when we found this photo and shared it with her. Also of note, that's not a round table she's leaning on. Like, everybody thinks all the tables are perfectly round. This is sort of like squared off with rounded corners. This was real neat. It was another behind the scenes photo, and she recreated it with Chris Bunn and Laurie Good, who also played Spacers.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, Laurie Good eventually played a Crocker for one of the days of shooting, but he was a Spacer for that one. There was a sister agency to the Ugly Agency, and it was called Pretty. And Angela Staines was from there. the steward's notes called for tall girls, and I think, doesn't this script say something about, like, Luke's impression was...
It's some of the tallest women you'd ever seen.
That's right, yeah. And I guess that's why they did the beehive hairdos, too, to add to that. But they've got her, everybody's measurements on these, and that's her outside the stage in costume. And for a while, she went by the name Angie Hu. And she did an interview with a friend of mine recently, and they went through some of her old photos and things like that. And she said people expected her to be an Asian actress because of the name, so she went back to Staines at some point. And there's Chrissy Hewitt, the other Tonica sister. Not twins, but sisters, which is a bit of another thing, which we've got a slide for.
Sure, yeah.
So yeah, initially there was a note for 5 girls, some bald heads, 2 with markings and mohawk hair, and that eventually, those mohawks became the beehive hairdos and the braids that we all know and love.
Yeah, this is interesting. So this is, the illustration there was published in 1989 in a Star Wars role-playing game source book called Galaxy Act 1, which for me was one of the first deep dives on the Cantina setting. And it introduced the idea that Seni and Bria Tunica were twins. And sure enough, they are identical in the illustration because it's the same image flipped the other way around. But what we didn't have access to back in the day was the actual reference photography this was based on, which we've since found in the archives. And it's evident and so clear that these two are not twins and were never intended to be twins.
And their outfits are different colors.
Yes.
One is blue, one is green, one has blue eyeshadow, one has green eyeshadow. They're sort of almost mirrored a little bit, but not really.
Yeah.
But yeah,
This is one of those
not
things.
the same height.
Yeah, this is one of those things that the expanded universe ran with a mistaken concept and made them twins, and then had to patch over that mistake by creating this elaborate story that the twins or the sisters that we see in the cantina are not actually the sisters; they're imposters. And it's like that's getting way too complicated to cover what was honestly a mistake.
Yeah, a lazy artist, like so many of us. So for years we thought Boschek was Anthony Lang. That's Anthony Lang on the right. He's got a nose a lot like mine, and he is clearly not Boschek.
The IMDb did not help because it listed Anthony Lang as
And
Boschek
people
for years and
assume
years and years.
that is, gospel.
Yeah.
Also carrying a pack of smokes, by the way, to set, but he was good enough not to light up during the scene. And eventually I got a call from a fellow who's a crime reporter, essentially, and he called me up and said that he had just wrapped an investigation with someone that had, was harming animals and had killed people and all this stuff, and I'm like, why are you calling me? I don't know if I want you to go on. And he said, I want to help you find Boschek. All right, he had seen one of our panels and knew it was someone we didn't know who it was, and he wound up through reaching out in a number of places and with some research by me, comparing names on lists, and we wound up finding Francis Alfred Basil Tomlin, who's also got one of the best eyebrows in the world, and there is your Boschek, so thank you. For a while we thought this fellow might be Anthony Lang. Apparently Anthony Lang is like the everyman of the cantina. Until a couple years back we discovered he is a fellow named Bill Risley, who turns up later in the briefing scene.
That's right, a lot of these actors are recycled through the movie.
And then, there we go. So we really do have Anthony Lang in Star Wars. He plays a dignitary in Return of the Jedi, and he's also in the briefing scene as well, but not as one of the pilots. Yay, thank you for spotting. Francis Bazzoni was also one of the Imperial dignitaries. He has an awesome Smurf hat, or whatever that is. I don't even know what that hat is. But he's in the cantina, and he shows up in a few of the shots in the background. So one of the other things, I see people trying to make maps of where people are in the cantina, and anybody who's ever been on a film set where there's a crowd knows, the crowd exists behind the principal people at all times. So if the camera's going this way, everyone's over there. Camera goes this way, everybody goes over here. So there's no definitive layout for where everybody is. And it doesn't help that half the people, the aliens, weren't even in the shots here. They were shot 6 months later on a different continent. And that's part 2, which is tomorrow.
It's another great face coming out of the Ugly Agency. It strikes me as funny because they still, even with this person's peculiar looks, they still gave them a prosthetic nose to further amplified the look.
And for years, this was another one like Anthony Lang was listed as Gilda Cohen for what seemed like forever. Yeah, and it's Jeff Moon, who also has one of the coolest jackets of all time. It says Florida. I don't know why we're blinking, but hopefully we're okay. And there's his ugly agency page. He's got a monkey.
That's part of his casting.
That's right. Well, he works well with animals. And they called him Lil Lamperoux for years because that's the character they thought he played, and they thought he was Gilda Cohen. And it's like, what are you even talking about? So we've been covering humans because I think a lot of times people just assume it's all aliens, but there really are a ton of them in there. So let's see what else is around in this bar of ours. Let's step outside for a minute. And this is George Lucas riding a dewback. Oh. Gasp is the correct response to that image. This is one of those things when you find it, you're like, I didn't know I needed this. I actually saw someone on Twitter write, I think it was a few weeks ago, it's like, I really just need to see that shot of George Lucas on the dewback right now. Like, that's just, hold me. And I just added the little black and white there so you can see where this is in relation to the cantina. And all of this wreckage here was supposed to initially carry over to the front of the bar. And that's where we have this sort of blueprint for the production showing that it was supposed to be made of some of the wreckage. But it ultimately ended up a stone piece, much like this drawing, which is a little later. And it was set to have a Perspex sign that for years confounded us.
We could tell that there was lettering in it, but we couldn't make it out.
This was the best shot we had for the longest time. We've got maybe 2 letters. And eventually, Roger Christian gave us this shot. And it's probably a little difficult to see on this screen, but this was a beautiful high-res shot. Also, that's the butt of a dewback. Now you know. And the dewback is actually built onto a rhinoceros body, for those that don't know. It started out, they made a head, they made a tail, and they put it on a rhinoceros-style body that was made for like a taxidermy form, and hid the seams with fur. But in this shot, we were able to get a much closer look at the sign, and we learned that it said, Spaga.
One of the closest thing we could have
Yeah, we still don't know why, but that has become our rallying cry. Yeah. So, Spaga. So there's Fred Pearl, whose art models company was named. The company sculpted the dewback and also the jerba beasts that are outside the cantina. And that's the early,
nice touch. Yeah, so you can see, I believe is that John Barry's art?
Yes.
Yeah, so John Barry, one of the production designers on the show, sketched out what the dewback was going to look like, and it had this basic classic dinosaur lizard frill on it, which was attempted to be created in this mold here.
Yeah, and I don't know whether that's something that just didn't survive the trip to Tunisia or was removed beforehand. But it's just cool to see a cool picture of it, and that's courtesy of Prop Store, which is a great place to find original movie props and things like that. Here's the Jerba's underway. They had a chicken mesh and wood frame there. We've got a couple people working on the head and finishing that. There's still one of these heads in the archives.
Yeah, to this day, Jerba is one of the pieces that has survived.
And it's their stumper, which to us is just kind of funny. But they bring you around the archives, and at the end they're like, oh, no one ever knows what this is. It's like, nice try. And there's George and Marcia Lucas, keeping with our George and Beasts theme here. That was at an event after the fact. That's probably the head that wound up in the archives. And the reason that head's in the archives is because they wound up reusing it in Return of the Jedi. It is on the either side of Han and Carbonite. One side is a Tauntaun mount, and one side is a Jerba mount. Oh, the Jawas. So there's Jawas in the cantina and outside. I used to call these guys siesta Jawas, because as they were walking in, they were just sort of hanging out. I always thought it was interesting. So they have hairy hands and things like that, and a lot of, I think we go into the hands later, but I always see a lot of things with like, oh, the Jawas have wraps around their faces to protect their whatever, I don't know, there's story there, but it's not wraps, it's tape. And that's how they held the eyes in place. Black gaffer tape.
Rare photo of an unmasked Jawa.
That's right, with Gary Kurtz doing it. I wonder if that's one of Gary's ones.
Kids,
yeah. So this is the crew that worked on the UK aliens. You've got, going from the left to the right, I'll just name the humans. Chris Tucker, Nick Malian in an amazing sweater, Sylvia Croft on the floor, Graham Freeborn in the tie, who was Stuart Freeborn's late son, who modeled a lot of the aliens, a lot of sculpting. Kay Freeborn, and then down on the bottom right in the cool leather jacket that Captain Kirk wore in part 3 and 4 is Robin Grantham. Here's Greedo before the surgery. This is the shot on the left came from Stuart Freeborn. He had saved this all these years. It is what he called a peapod alien. It was made for a Bird's Eye commercial in the 70s, and Stuart was a pack rat. He saved everything. He reused everything he could, and Greedo is built on these peapod aliens.
This is another one of these holy grail things that Tom and I are looking, because we've seen other Bird's Eye commercials from the era on YouTube and whatnot that may have been from Stuart's work because they have creature works, but we've not found the one that featured the peapod alien.
Someday,
that's like
if you ever see it, let us know.
Yes.
And maybe Billy Jensen will call us up.
Yeah, that's right.
Tell us about some terrible murder he solved, and then, oh, by the way, here's the piece.
Someone was killed with a tape of the peapod.
That's right. So speaking of someone was killed, here's how Han shot Greedo. Not just under the table, but through the table. And it was something that we didn't ever realize until we started to see some of these photos from behind the scenes. And the booth is pretty large there too. You can see there's another table set.
That's right, second table.
So most of the times when the scene's recreated, they do one booth, one table, 2 sets of chairs, and that's it. Here they are working on the stunt dummy that was there for the pyro effect when and then the fall. Actually, this is probably just for the pyro effect.
So, yeah.
And there's a couple of the art department, I would imagine, working on setting him up, or props. There's Sylvia Croft and Robin Grantham installing the eyeballs. You can see the hand is not really well formed.
The gun's just kind of jammed in there.
They were going to burn him up anyway. Speaking of hands,
yeah.
so
Go ahead.
No, go.
Well, this is one of the Crockers. The Crockers are some more memorable aliens, mostly because the reptilian face became the basis for Bosk in the next movie. But this is sort of Generation 1 Bosk, and it was a little less formed, and it was on a couple of characters that has since been named Sorens in the Star Wars universe, but we know them as Crockers because of the way they were described. We know they're not the same species as Bosk because when they made Bosk, they gave them these big, 3-pronged, taloned hands, whereas the Crockers, their hands are not all that elaborate.
No. Well, in one case, they have these sort of dish gloves with warts and bumps and scales on them, and then eventually those were peeling up too much, so they just gave them dish gloves.
And you can see it falling apart right there.
Yeah,
in
it's
the movie.
peeling off on the screen. And they each had these hunchy shoulder sort of things going on too, which was neat. And then here's the Crocker just before it was turned into Bosk on the ESP set. This came off that Behind the Magic CD-ROM years ago. It's the first time I saw it anyway. And that's also Graham Freeborn posing with a sculpting tool on a fully finished mask that would never be sculpted. But that's how a lot of stuff happens on sets. They're like, oh, we need a shot of you guys working on this thing, and you just pull out the nearest finished thing. You get the biggest, dumbest tool you could find that no one would ever use, and you do it so that at least the effects guys in the audience watching will go like, we got you.
There's a behind-the-scenes photo, just going off topic for a bit, of The Empire Strikes Back, Phil Tippett with a Tauntaun stop-motion model. And we have something called movement gauge, which is a single item that you basically line up with the model so that you understood where a certain body part was before you move it. It was a behind-the-scenes photo. The photographer was like, can you give us something to make it look interesting? So he put like half a dozen movement gauges on it, which you would never do. And he knew that this was just BS. But that photo is like out there in the
it's
world.
everywhere. So Bosk's spacesuit was also something that turns up in the cantina, and it's this Windac pressure suit that turned up in a movie called First Men in the Moon years before this. It also shows up in Doctor Who. And Boschek and the spacesuit, what is he, space dude? Cantina dude, something like that. The yellow one gets a dude on it, I don't know. That's just like fanon though. So that turns up and then shows up later in Empire Strikes Back. And now, who can spot the other bounty hunter from Empire Strikes Back in this photo? Yeah, not you.
Oh, and I know a little German.
Yeah, oh, there's Marcus Powell.
Yes, the IG-88 head.
And it's also, it's from this engine, a Rolls-Royce Derwent airplane engine. And there's the head in there. And the larger thing that it's encapsulated in, this is a cutaway, is also one of the drink dispensers in the cantina, if you look back there. So behind the pickle head, you see the other ones?
Yeah, the production, basically Roger Christian led a scavenger hunt through junkyards where they had a lot of airplane pieces. And so a lot of the background junk in Star Wars is just discarded pieces from airplane parts.
Well, and so here you have stuff that's hanging on the wall. These are all parts from that same engine. This is like a tearaway. And there are also, so the combustion canister up on the top right, that's where the IG-88 head lives. You have the cooling fan and that stuff that's here. Also within that combustion canister is the little firing mechanism thing, and that turns out to be Obi-Wan's lightsaber emitter, which was a part no one knew what it was for years and years. And we were hunting the IG-88 stuff, and somebody said, boy, this thing in the blueprint, that looks a lot like the sink drain on Obi-Wan's thing, because everybody thought it was a sink drain. And sure enough, it was just another piece of the airplane.
The rear air intake is actually on the back of the Mars family speeder, too. So it's like, cool. These pieces just keep on giving.
Yeah, I think you're right on that. So this is the sort of thing we love to do. We take a picture and we look in the background. The first time we looked in the background, we saw the fly guy, we saw the land speeder salesman, we saw Sept, and it was years later that we looked again and we saw a crocodile. And it's as big as life. There's a crocodile on it. And we missed it. For years, we missed it. And it turns out it's like a taxidermy form of this particular type of crocodile, in case anybody wants to make one and put it on their wall and say it's a cantina prop. And then looking behind Obi-Wan, there's still from the movie, there's a big cat skull. We thought this might have been a saber tooth, but it's actually just a regular, like a lion or a tiger or a bear. Thank you. You can always count on someone. There's other stuff on the other side that looks like maybe like a seal head and a shark. But then what's this thing over the bar, like up over the Crocker's head there? This we had seen in shots, but never really thought about until we started to see the other taxidermy. Now we don't have anything definitive. This is the clearest shot I could find of it in the Lucasfilm archives, and it's not great. But as sometimes happens, you turn something upside down and maybe you see something new. So for me, I turned it upside down, as I often do. And I thought, is that a fish? Because it looks like a fish to me, but I don't know. It could be an upside down fish, which if something, on Earth it's a fish, right. But if it's upside down,
it's a space fish.
Space fish, yeah.
That's how you Star Wars creatures.
That's right. This was another thing we just recently started looking at, and it's the logos. I want to do a panel on the logos of the first Star Wars. Everything has branding, and there are all these really cool little graphic art pieces. So the Cantina cups have this little logo on it, and we were going through and we were able to figure out, you immediately picked up that it's, what do they call that one? Is that the flying meatball?
Yeah. It's whatever's on the side of the Rebel pilot helmet. So whoever this company is got a really good sponsorship with the Star Wars movie because it shows up a couple of times in the movie this way.
And now this is another thing going through behind the, there's the canisters. Yep. Those are the combustion canisters. And there's a keyboard, like a regular keyboard, but it's upside down, so it's a space keyboard. Hashtag spacefish. Love these guys, the Crockers. This is a perfect example of what Graham and Stuart used to do. They look like they're out of the same mold, but when you look closer, they're not. They took appliances and tweaked them a little bit. One guy's different eyes, extra eye bags and things like that, different hair. And it was their way of using parts that they had in molds to extend the life of them and get more out of it, just like the two different Mos Eisley aliens.
Yeah, so the previous characters are also, production names are known as the Hair Mouse. Sometimes they're called the Colonel. These characters, making things confusing, because of course, if it's Cantina related, it has to be confusing, are sometimes called the Walrus, but they have nothing to do with Walrus Man.
Right.
Go figure. We know them as Mosa because it's a name that was applied years after the fact.
Chronicles, I think, was the first time I saw that.
And, but many people who grew up reading the original Marvel Star Wars comic also know it as the fake Jabba the Hutt. The original Marvel comic first started publishing before Star Wars ever came out. It beat Star Wars to the theater by about 2 months or so. So you can actually read the first few issues before the movie ever came out. And it included scenes that were cut from the movie, including the big scene and most famously Han's confrontation with Jabba. George knew he was cutting that sequence out, and he said, I wasn't happy with Jabba. I've always wanted him to be an alien. So we have the footage of Irishman Declan Mulholland playing Jabba in his big furry tunic or whatnot. He didn't want that. All the comic guys knew is they wanted him to be an alien, and so they took one of the Cantina aliens and made that character Jabba the Hutt.
And next to him is a blue snaggletooth, so it's the rare, expensive variant. And that's one of the hair mouse guys next to that. I love the Marvel take on these guys too. And there's you've got, that's how Snaggletooth actually looked. You've also got Sept in the background, the rat alien, the very tall one, talking to the guy wearing the jacket that was worn by Boshek, who doesn't smoke in the cantina, will never speak of it. And there are two R2-D2s in this shot, though. One that doesn't quite look right, and it's because R2 couldn't make the turn. So they had one R2 walk up with the main characters, and then they turn the camera, and another one zooms in from the other side. And I've now ruined that scene for you forever. But really cool in the background is the 94 symbol on the wall. That's another thing that went unnoticed for a very long time.
More of that graphic fonts. That graphic design
Love
work
it.
in Star Wars is great.
And this is, of course, just, I'm not going to go through all the math here, but those are your two different snaggletooths that were in the movie, snaggletooths. And somehow that blue thing in the kiss boots was what the action figure turned out to be. And there's Snaggletooth with his mask off, actually. And the multi-eyed guy in the back, cool gonk up front with graphics on him. That Snaggletooth did get to dance.
That's right.
I forget what, it was his Vogue?
I think it was Vogue, yeah.
They did a thing in the late 70s, and you had, this was before the holiday special, because that mask was eventually modified for the holiday special. And he's, yeah.
And I do want to point out about something about this reference photo of Snaggletooth. It looks like he's wearing a scarf, and he's not. In fact, Hasbro took this reference photo and made an action figure of Snaggletooth with this scarf on it. But what it is it's inside shirt tucked out. It's basically his dickie.
Yeah.
And he has that outside of his shirt, and so Hasbro assumed that he was wearing a scarf in the photo. He's not.
So guy in the left, wrong. Guy in the middle, right. Guy in the right, cool, but I have no idea. Like, and he's wearing a Tuscan Raider robe there, by the way.
When he's dancing, a Vogue model.
So this is another sort of rarity in the cantina. You've got this great, as Mark Hamill called him, a giant cricket at the bar. That's one of Stewart's early sketches of a character played by Jack Purvis. And this one haunted you for a long time.
Yes, Grasshopper. Grasshopper shows up most famously in a spread in the original art of Star Wars, where John Mallow has basically several dozen cantina designs sketched out for the costume assignment, essentially. And there was this character here, just called Grasshopper, who doesn't resemble anything that we see in the cantina. The fact that this illustration was made so close to production tells me that there was a potential for this character to be in the bar, but we never saw him.
So I went through Stuart Freeborn's notes, which I happen to have a bunch of his paperwork that was he used in the film. And he mentions Grasshopper numerous times. And he mentions all the other aliens too, so we're able to process of elimination knock that out. But he did have this sketch, which, if you look in the very back of this, it's tough to tell, but there is a human head in there on the right-hand side. And he's also got these tendrils and antenna and stuff like that. And along with Stuart's sketches, he also had a box full of teeth and antenna and nails and fingers and who knows what, as all good effects guys do. And in there were these two green grasshopper-like antennae, which folks who have worked on the movie think are the only things remaining from this character that just didn't get built in time and didn't get to make it on screen. Now, wearing an actual scarf is Walrus Man, which no one ever puts on the figures, but he wears it.
And it's quite visible in the film, but for whatever reason, it's one of these details that we've all forgotten about.
And now, in the fight, initially they talk about maybe the grasshopper was around, there's the fly and the rodent. And so the fly eventually gets replaced with Walrus Man. The rodent, it becomes the bat, which is Cave. And if you look at the film, Dr. Evans and Walrus Man are talking to Cave as if he's like part of their crew. And that's a movie I want to see, like a Star Wars story, you know, like.
So famously in lore, people remember and have, of course, extrapolated stories of Walrus Man, Pandadava, and Grubby Human, Dr. Evison, are a pair, and they have all sorts of adventures together. But they always forget that Cabe was actually part of this trio, at least as envisioned in the film.
And if you look at his reaction, he's clearly invested in what's just happened here.
Yeah, to me that's Cabe thinking, my meal ticket, it's
Right.
gone.
And there's some great behind-the-scenes photos of the Bat Alien. Here is, of course, the big mystery of Walrus Man's hand changing. I assume most of you, if you're here, you know this. They shot it initially with the big flipper hands. They eventually, when they shot a close-up of the gun on the ground, they reshot it with a Wolfman hand, so it made more sense. Will you tell?
Sure. So, the question always comes up from the canon point of view, what is Walrus Man's hands actually like? And the version that I like in my head, which isn't canon, but this is the way I accept it, is those flipper hands are actually gloves, and I'm Canadian, so anyone knows when you get into a hockey fight, the first thing you do is you throw down your gloves.
Drops the gloves.
And underneath that, he's got his furry, wolf-like hands. The thing that's funny that people don't realize is that depending on what reference photos you use, Walrus Man loses a different arm. He loses his left arm or his right arm, depending on what image that you're using. So the original photo shoot from the UK had one arm on the ground, and it ended up being the opposite arm that ends up.
Because with the flipper hands, you can't tell what arm it is.
Exactly.
And so yeah, the way that he holds that gun is they sliced a hole in the bottom of the flipper hand and jammed the handle through it so the actor could hold it beneath. They say we're running a little short on time. There's the one where we show his left arm off, but all the figures show the right arm because the Wolfman's the right arm, but everybody had these flipper hands.
Fly Guy had up the
Land Speeder guy. They even turn up in Empire Strikes Back with fingers cut into them. It's a cheap mold, that's why they use them so often. This is my favorite bit of literary history ever. This is the literary description, novel description of the Land Speeder sales guy. He's called the apartment house for wayward eyeballs because he's just covered in random eyes and nonsense. There he is talking to a Mos Eisley with a very visible seam up the back and a cool droid up front. I always love that guy. And let's see here. There's his wrinkly blob, sickly mouth, sucker mouth, disgusting quality to the skin. Those are all Stewart's notes to create this fella. Now, eventually, ultimately, this scene was actually supposed to be much more gory than it was wound up on film, and now we know why Cabe was so upset. We do happen to have some footage of that. It's very short. Does anyone want to see it? Yeah, no, too bad. It doesn't sound like they want to see it. All right, are you ready? Everybody get your strawberry yogurt out.
So the idea is it would have panned over from the
Yeah, on the bottom, the pulsating, right? Yeah, wait for it. Yeah. I like the yogurt coming out of the broken tusks.
And to this day, that tusk is broken. We have this in the archives, and the tusk is cracked.
Yeah, there's pulsating. That's all we got there. So, So, on the last 3 slides here, we're wrapping up. Thank you very much. We were a little late, so we're trying. There is one other victim that should never be forgotten in this fight. It's this cup. Obi-Wan, when he does his backswing, they actually had a practical effect where that cup was cut in half. So, it was shocking. Walrus Man is shocked, clearly. That's what we got. We did our giveaway of the book before. If anybody loves Star Wars creatures, come to booth 1031. I've got a bunch of this book that I worked on. It's really cool and full of awesome pictures. And tomorrow we have part 2 of the Cantina with all the rest of the aliens and the stories of Rick Baker's crew. So join us right back here in this same room. Thank you very much.